Hey guys, and welcome to my final limited review video for Shadows Over Innistrad. This is the 8th and final video in that series. A annotation should be up on the screen somewhere for you to click on if you haven't seen the other videos. But over the last 7 days, we have discussed the best commons and uncommons in each color, the best rares and mythics in each format, and the cards I think we should avoid when we're drafting. Today, I go the most in-depth as I will in talking about the limited format, other than in my draft videos, which will come later, obviously. And I'll discuss every single color pair in Shadows Over Innistrad, the key cards for each of these archetypes, and how well supported each individual archetype is. Every time I do this archetype video, it is incredibly long, and this is because I have to discuss tons of cards between the 10 color pairs. Because of the length of this video, in the description you can find timestamps that will take you to each specific color pair, so you can watch this video piece by piece instead of just having to sit down and watch this. In addition to talking about each color pair individually, this time for the first time in doing a limited review archetype discussion, I'm going to at the end give my preliminary observations about which are the best archetypes, which are the worst, and so forth. By the way, keep in mind that as I'm recording this, the pre-releases haven't even happened, and it's fairly likely that my opinions will change somewhat with time. This is something you can continue to observe if you watch my weekly draft videos in the new format once it's out on Magic Online. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started since this, as I said, is a very long video. So there's sort of two sets of color pairs in Shadows Over Innistrad. There always are, I guess. There's allied color pairs and there's enemy colored pairs. And in this one, they sort of embody very different things. The allied color pairs are all tribal kind of decks. As you can see here, we have blue-white spirits, blue-black zombies, red-black vampires, red-green wolves and werewolves, and green-white humans. This is the same, more or less, as the archetypes in the original Innistrad block. But they all sort of have a less, tribal aspect to all of their themes as well. As you can see, blue-white spirits is skies, blue-black zombies is graveyards, red-black vampires is the best deck for madness, transform is a big part of the wolves and werewolves decks, and equipment and investigating are sort of two sub-themes within the human decks. So those are what the allied color pairs are, and we'll go ahead and jump into the very first one. For every color combination in a limited format, usually anyway, there's a card which is supposed to sort of embody the archetype. Usually that card's gold, but they did something a little different this time around, and they printed monocolored cards, but that have activated abilities of another color. And in this case, for the tribal ones, they're all creatures, as you might expect. And for the blue-white spirits deck, the card that sort of embodies that archetype is Spectral Shepherd. All of these cards are very strong, really. This is a 3-mana 2/2 with flying, something you'd play anyway, and it can protect itself. Even if spirits weren't a thing, Spectral Shepherd would be a pretty solid card to have in your deck. But spirits are a thing, so we're going to go ahead and look at some key commons and uncommons that either are spirits or care about spirits in one way or another. It's important to remember, too, that this deck is also sort of just a skies deck, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. So here are some of the key commons and uncommons you'll be looking for if you find yourself in the spirit deck. We have Apothecary Geist, who is quite a good card if you have another spirit, but is sort of meh otherwise. We just recently had Courier Griffin, who you can compare to this, and he's actually better than Courier Griffin because he gains you 1 additional life, but only if you control another spirit. So he's a card you really only want in a spirit deck. And there are several spirits in blue and white. That's why this is the archetype for them. The second one we have is Moorland Drifter, a 2-mana 2/2, a bear who also happens to be a spirit, so it has a few spirit synergies. Also has Delirium, so at times it sort of joins the skies with the other spirits and gains flying if you can hit Delirium. Emissary of the Sleepless is a pretty good card as well, a 5-mana 2/4 flyer. You can see, again, this is basically a skies deck that happens to be spirits. If another creature died during your turn, you can put into play a additional spirit token as well. And if you can always do that with Emissary of the Sleepless, I think you're going to be pretty happy, especially in a spirit deck. There's also Topplegeist, a 1-mana 1/1 flyer. I don't usually recommend playing those, but this one taps something down, so it does something. And if you get Delirium, which is possible in basically any deck in this format, you can actually tap. It gets the Sentinel of the Eternal Watch ability, and you get to tap down one of their creatures every upkeep, which is actually pretty absurd, as we learned in Magic Origins. Another card is Vessel of Ephemera, a card that sort of helps you go wide, gives you a couple spirit tokens. It also helps you get to Delirium, because enchantments aren't the easiest thing to get into your graveyard. Then there's Nearheath Chaplain, who is a sought-after card in basically any deck that has white in it, I'll say. I think it's one of the best uncommons in white, at least. as a 3/1 lifelinker. But once it's in your graveyard, it can also pump out a couple spirit tokens to join your other flying spirits. And Dauntless Cathar is sort of the little brother of Nearheath Chaplain, although he actually has more toughness, but once he's in the graveyard, he makes less spirits. There's also, of course, blue spirits. There's Erdwall Illuminator, who I don't think is actually at its best in this deck, but a 2-mana 1/3 flyer is usually playable. There's other decks, especially the blue-green one, which we'll eventually get to, that I think Erdwall Illuminator is even better in. But still, it's a flying spirit who has a useful ability because clues and investigate are things that happen in every color combination, although it'll be more common in the blue-green one, which I'll talk about later. Niblis of Dusk is a very good card. It's basically a functional reprint of Jeskai Wind Scout, which we had in Khans of Tarkir, a 3-mana 2/1 with flying and prowess, also a spirit. And we also have Stormrider Spirit, who has flash and flying as a 3/3. That's a pretty solid common. One I think anyone playing blue will probably want to put into their deck. And then there's also one transforming card at common or uncommon for spirits, and that is Uninvited Geist, who has Skulk, making him a little less easy to block than normal. And he can transform once he does damage to an opponent into Unimpeded Trespasser. So those are the commons and uncommons, and you can probably sort of see that unfortunately there's really not that much payoff at common or uncommon for playing spirits. This is basically just a blue-white skies deck that has a few spirits. The only real payoff there is at these colors and at this rarity is the not that exciting Apothecary Geist and the card that sort of embodies the archetype, the 3-mana 2/2 who can bounce spirits for you, which is a relevant effect. But sadly, most of the spirits don't even have enter the battlefield abilities that matter. I mean, Apothecary Guys can occasionally gain you life, and Emissary of the Sleepless can occasionally give you a 1/1, and Topple Guys can tap something. So they all do some stuff. But if they'd given a really powerful enter the battlefield ability, this archetype would probably be a lot stronger just because the uncommon that's supposed to embodiment is very good. However, I will say there are 2 rares that are very good and make this archetype sort of come together if you can get one of these. Rattle Chains is a 2-mana 2/1 flyer with flash, who when it enters the battlefield can give a spirit hexproof, a very relevant thing, negates an opponent's removal, and then also gives all your spirits flash, also very relevant. And then Drogskull Cavalry is a bit of a bomb. I don't think it's quite like game-breaking because it is unfortunately very expensive and easy to kill, but if you're allowed to untap with Drogskull Cavalry in play in a spirit deck, even not in a spirit deck, let's be honest, your opponent's going to have a hard time beating you because it's possible on your next turn you can make 2 spirit tokens and gain 4 life, plus all your other spirits also gain you life as well. I will say I don't think blue-white spirits is very adequately supported, but the fact that it's basically just a traditional blue-white skies deck, a deck that's usually a pretty solid deck, doesn't mean that it's weak by any means. I just kind of wish there was a little more synergy going on, but there's really not. So that's blue-white spirits. Now we'll move on to the next archetype, which is blue-black zombies. Once again, this was the archetype of the original Innistrad as well, and it's the archetype here. The card meant to embody the blue-black archetype in this format is Drunau Corpse Trawler. Quite a good card, as most of these are. Most of these, they're not gold, but they're basically gold cards. He's a 4-mana 1/1, but he does put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield, and he can give zombies death touch. So if you're in blue-black, this guy's actually very strong because, if you play your cards right and your opponent doesn't have a bunch of removal or something, that means that even if you just have Drunau Corpse Trawler in play, you suddenly have 2 creatures who can trade for anything, assuming you have the mana. And that's pretty great. So he's good. He makes zombies. He has synergy with zombies because he can give any zombie death touch. So let's look at the commons and uncommons and see how much more synergy there is within the zombie deck. It's also worth noting that the zombie deck has a bit of a graveyard sub-theme, as zombie decks almost always do, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So there are some payoff cards for playing zombies. One of them is Compelling Deterrence. It's a pretty solid card in a non-zombie deck. It's basically Disperse. It is Disperse. It's Disperse with upside because it returns a non-land permanent instant speed. But if you control a zombie, you can then also make them discard a card. So it's actually an incredibly strong card in the later part of the game because it becomes a removal spell, which is quite nice. Also, the zombie in that picture looks a lot like Dr. Zoidberg from Futurama. Further solidifying the card is very good. But really, though, it is a good card, especially if you have zombies. It's a card you'd play even if you didn't. But if you have zombies, it's a very good card. Another zombie payoff that's a little less exciting is Lamplighter of Selhoff. It's a 5-mana 3/5 who has an Enter the Battlefield ability, so you're pretty sold on that as a common. You would probably run one of these in a zombie deck. Whenever it enters the battlefield, if you have a zombie, you can draw a card, and if you do, you can discard a card, meaning you can set off Madness if you want to, although typically if you're paying 5 mana for a 3/5, you're not going to have a whole lot of mana left over to pay for Madness, but maybe you do. You can also use it to get you to Delirium. So those are two of the payoff cards for zombies in blue. There's some other zombies in blue that are perfectly playable, like Seagroth Scob, a card that gets really good if you can give a Death Touch with the Drew Now whatever zombie guy. This is Stitched Mangler, which I think is one of the best commons in the set. Happens to be a zombie. It is a card everyone playing blue will shove into their deck, though. Hound of the Farbogs is basically filler, I think. But, you'll probably end up running one around half the time. And it's an example of how the deck cares about graveyards, just like Lamplighter of Selhoff is. Stitchwing Scob, another card that indicates to you how much the deck cares about graveyards, because it's a 4-mana 3/1 flyer, pretty playable already. But on top of that, once it ends up in your graveyard, whether you milled it there yourself or whether it died, you can bring it back by discarding cards, which can get you to Delirium, and which can allow you to trigger Madness, which both are good. Then we have Crow of Dark Tidings, a zombie bird who mills you. So, he can throw Stitchwing Scob in your graveyard, set up, you being able to cast him for the reduced cost that he sometimes is castable for. There's also Ghoul Steed, who's a lot like Stitchwing Scob. I don't think quite as good, but can come back from the graveyard and is a 4/4. No evasive ability. There's also Gissa's Bidding, which lets you go wide, lets you do Madness stuff, so it works in conjunction with Stitchwing Scob and Goldsteed. Can you imagine the turn where you discard Gissa's Bidding and like a land to bring back your Stitchwing Scob, and you have the mana to pay for the Madness? Because that's going to be a disgusting thing that can happen. For just 5 mana, you get 7 power and 5 toughness, and 3 of it has flying. So that's something this zombie deck can do. Unfortunately, those are both uncommon, so it's not going to happen all the time. And there's also Rancid Rats, who can trade for anything, and also has Skulk, so it can get through. There's other cards that care about the graveyard that are good in this deck because of stuff like Ghoul Steed and Stitchwing Scob. And those are Macabre Waltz, which is very good with stuff with Madness too. And another tribal deck we'll talk about in a moment, it's actually probably better. But it is, very good with Madness. It's good in this deck too because it can get you cards back. Liliana's Indignation, I'm sort of torn on. I think it's either completely unplayable or someone will somehow build a deck that it's actually good in. Ghoul Caller's Accomplice is a 2-mana 2/2 who can make zombies from the graveyard. So if he gets milled, you still get some value out of him. So again, I don't feel like Blue-Black Zombies actually has a huge amount of support, and especially not at common and uncommon. I don't think it's going to be the most amazing archetype. I'll talk about where I sort of rank it later. But I do think it's going to be a solid deck. There's decent payoffs for being in zombies, most of which are uncommon, unfortunately. And a lot of the zombies are efficiently costed good creatures anyway. But that also means other people will be after those cards. However, at rare, there are several good zombies. You have Forgotten Creation, who's a 4-mana 3/3 with Skulk. Already an okay card. It has an evasive ability. But on top of that, it can also let you rip through your deck incredibly quickly while also doing Madness things and discarding cards that you're going to, get back one way or another anyway. And then, so that makes Forgotten Creation pretty sweet. Geralf's Masterpiece is another card that you're almost happier if it gets milled because you can bring it back by discarding 3 cards, and it's this massive monster. Diregraph Colossus is very good in this zombie deck. If in like pack 1 you've picked up 6 or 7 zombies and you open Diregraph Colossus in pack 2, you should probably build a zombie deck. He's that strong. He replaces himself too if you're careful. And he can be absolutely massive. Relentless Dead is going to be a card you'll probably be taking anyway because it's probably going to be expensive because I predict that it will see play in Constructed. But it's also very good. It's first pickable, actually, even though it's double black, because it's so good. It doesn't die, basically, as long as you leave black up. And then it can return other zombies to your battlefield. And then Prized Amalgam. Like, if I ever manage to draft a blue-black deck that has Prized Amalgam in it, it's going to be like one of the best days ever. I might have to build a constructed deck that looks to do that too, because Prized Amalgam, we talked about 3 cards, 2 of which are uncommon that can come back from the graveyard, and Prized Amalgam also comes back anytime you play something from the graveyard. But again, I don't think there's a huge amount of support at common or uncommon for zombies. I think it's sort of just like a aggro it's more of a mid-range deck that has some good control magic and some good removal that can play some formidable zombie creatures who can win you the game. So that is the blue-black zombie archetype, and from there we will move on to black-red vampires. The card meant to sort of indicate where you should go with this deck is Olivia's Bloodsworn, a 2-mana 2/1 who can't block but has flying and can give vampires haste. So you're sort of seeing a theme here of these creatures that can give keyword abilities to creatures who have the same type as them. Worth noting, the Bloodsworn can actually give itself haste. All of them can actually give the keywords to themselves, and that includes Olivia's Bloodsworn. So sometimes you'll be able to attack with it the turn you draw it if you have red mana, but it's also just an aggressive creature. It's definitely not one you really want to be first picking. Most of these aren't because they commit you to 2 colors, and Olivia's Bloodsworn's not strong enough at all to warrant that the way that some cards were in Battle for Zendikar. Some of the gold ones were. So we've talked so far about 2 tribes who seem solid but don't have a whole lot of synergy and support. And I'll just, spoiler alert, I think zombies have a lot of support, and I think they're going to be one of the stronger archetypes. So let's go ahead and talk about the commons and uncommons for this deck. One of them is Indulgent Aristocrat. One of the payoffs for being a vampire deck he's a 1-mana 1/1 with lifelink who lets you sacrifice a creature and pump your whole team, assuming you manage to get a bunch of vampires in play. Not always going to happen in limited, obviously, but even if you just have a few vampires, by the way, he puts the counter on himself as well. That's a pretty powerful ability, especially like in response to removal. Or any number of other things. Or, it also just makes combat a nightmare for your opponent when you say swing with everything and you have 3 or 4 vampires and your opponent's like, great, they're put in a really tough situation. Another payoff is Stromkirk Mentor, a 4-mana 4/2, who also does stuff with +1/+1 counters. He only puts 1 counter on 1 vampire, though, and it has to be another vampire. So he's not, like, incredible or anything, but if you actually have a deck that got there on vampires, he gets pretty good. But here is where we start seeing the cards that I think have massive amounts of synergy and will make the vampire deck very strong. And that is the fact that the vampire deck has a madness sub-theme, and I think that its sub-theme is really well supported within the tribe in a way that the sub-themes in the others, they're supported, but there's also no vampire synergy. No synergy between, like, spirits, for example, for the most part, other than that they all have flying, things like that. But there's lots of ways within vampires to discard cards, and there's lots of ways, lots of creatures with madness, or other spells too in these colors, and we'll get to that. There's also Vampire Noble, who's just a vanilla 3-mana 3/2, something you normally don't want to be playing, but it'll make it into your deck sometimes. Insolent Neonate is a card that normally I think would be really bad, but if you really get there on a vampire deck, you probably want Insolent Neonate. Because he enables madness, and then the card gets replaced even though you're getting to cast it, and sacrificing him helps you get to Delirium. So, I still wouldn't play him most of the time unless my deck ended up being just like all vampires and like 8 cards with madness. Then I might play him, but I have him on here because I think the vampire deck will occasionally get there, and the Neonate will be worth it. The next card we have to look at is Heir of Falkenrath, which I think is the best black uncommon. It's a 2-mana 2/1 who has a transform ability that allows you to discard a card. And the discard doesn't cost anything, by the way. So you can discard a card, say Twins of Martyr Estate, and flip your Heir of Falkenrath into an Heir to the Night, and suddenly your board is like really scary. You can do that on turn 3, you guys. You have to get there and you have to get the cards, but that's something that's going to happen to all of us in Limited, either against us or for us at least once in this format. And when it happens, it's not going to be a lot of fun for us, unless we're the ones doing it. Then it's awesome. But that's sort of the point I have about how much synergy and how strong these colors are. We also have another creature with madness. He's a 3-mana 4/1, which isn't completely terrible for 3 mana. It can get killed by 1/1. But if you can play it for its madness cost, it's pretty solid. And if it ever gets hit your opponent, it gets larger. So, he's not nearly as good as, say, Twins of Martyr Estate to flash into madness in, but he's another vampire with flash. Then one of the other strong vampires with flash, which, by the way, you can also do this on turn 3, which probably is even worse. Flip your Heir to the Night by discarding Incorrigible Youths, pay 3 mana, swing at your opponent for 7 on turn 3. So if you're the one on the play, your opponent probably can't do a damn thing about that, and that's frightening. So there's 2 different, cards that allow it, and one of them's actually a common. The Twins of Martyr Estate are common. So, and then, if there weren't already enough like free discard outlets, within the vampire deck. We also have Ravenous Bloodseeker, who's a 2-mana 1/3, basically passes the vanilla test. But on top of that, he can also get +2/-2 when you discard a card, meaning he can become a 4/1 for a turn, a 3/1 rather. Basically, switches his power and toughness. But on top of that, that enables Madness for free. So you can, again, discard things like Incorrigible Youths or Twins of Mara Estate and get the Madness off of them. Another card is Valdaran Duelist. This one doesn't have any of the fancy Madness or Madness synergies, but it's a solid vampire card. It's a 4-mana 3/2 that has, the Goblin Heel Cutter ability in that it can come into play, make something unable to block, and it itself has haste, so that creates a lot of problems for your opponent. There are so many commons and uncommons in these colors that I had to do a whole other page, so here's some more. That's how good this deck is, because it has so many cards that fit well together. We have Stensia Masquerade, another very good card, one that you can also discard to any of the discard outlets we've already mentioned, one that gives all creatures first strike, and makes all your vampires get the +1/+1 counter when they hit the opponent ability. So another pretty scary card. And, and I'm not usually a huge fan of enchantments that don't affect the board immediately. But this one does a little bit by giving your guys first strike, makes them harder to block, and can make your vampires larger, making Stensia Masquerade quite good, I think. Here I also have Fiery Temper, which is good in any red deck, admittedly. But as we've talked about, red and black, especially vampires, have lots of ways of discarding cards for free or cheaply. And so Fiery Temper fits best probably in the red-black vampire deck. Mad Prophet, not a vampire, but fits very well into this deck because of all the Madness cards. It lets you dig through your library, and that's what you want. Another card with Madness, just because cards with Madness are at their best in this deck, is Malevolent Whispers. Lets you gain control of a creature, so if you discard a card to flip your 3/2, steal their creature and smash them, then, there's another... I know I'm stating the ideal situation, but there's even the unideal situations with these discard effects that give you Madness are pretty gross. Call the Bloodline, another card that easily enables Madness while also giving you a Vampire Knight creature token with lifelink. Discarding Stensia Masquerade with Call the Bloodline is pretty sweet, I think. There's also Gissa's Bidding, which, again, doesn't do anything with vampires, but it has Madness. This deck will easily be able to cast it for 3, more easily than even the zombie deck will be able to most of the time. And that's one reason I really like Gissa's Bidding more in the vampire deck, sadly, for zombies. And I mentioned Macabre Waltz earlier. It is better in this deck because you can do gross stuff like return 2 creatures from your graveyard and then discard a card with Madness, even if it was one of the ones in your graveyard, and just play it. And it only costs 2, so you can cast a lot of the Madness creatures. And Murderous Compulsion, a card that's, again, good in any deck, but at its best here because this deck can maximize the chances you have for Madness. And same with Lightning Axe, good in any red deck, but best in this one. Although it's good in the blue-red one, too, because it also has a decent amount of Madness. But here it's very good because of Madness. And, we see tons of commons and uncommons supporting this deck. We see great synergy. By the way, there's a bunch of rares, too, who are good for this deck. Falkenrath Gorger gives all your vampires Madness. So they all gain Madness, so you can manipulate and abuse discard effects all you want when you have Falkenrath Gorger in play. Not a card I would recommend first picking because it's not the greatest card if you don't end up in a vampire deck, but sort of like other cards I mentioned, especially in the zombie deck, if you see a Falkenrath Gorger like near the end of a pack or in the early parts of pack 2, after you have a ton of vampires, you should take it because it's that good. Asylum Visitor, another solid one, has Madness too, so it fits well into discard effects. And the 2-mana 3/1 that lets you draw a card and lose 1 life at the beginning of each player's upkeep if the player's turn, who it is, it doesn't have any cards in their hand. Markov Dread Knight is just like a walking, 5-mana. He's, wants to do Madness, basically. He's a 5-mana 3/3, lets you discard stuff and permanently put counters on him. So after even 1 discard, even if you don't do Madness, he gets to be a ridiculous threat for your opponent. Olivia Mobilized for War is mythic and probably should be because while she doesn't actually look that incredible, in this deck, she's pretty ridiculous because she's a 3-mana 3/3 with flying, already great. But whenever another creature enters a battlefield, you can discard a card, say a card with Madness, And if you do, the creature you just play gets a +1/+1 counter and gains haste. Then there's Elusive Tormentor, who I think is one of the biggest flavor wins of the set, in a set filled with flavor wins, by the way. But it's a 4-mana 4/4, 1 to discard a card which transformed it, so you can again manipulate Madness. And once it transforms, kind of the idea is just that you can reflip it every turn, and your opponent can't stop it because they have to take 4 every time. Unless, of course, they play removal after you flip it back to being an Elusive Tormentor. But that also means you can do the discard ability over and over again. So Black-Red Vampires, I think one of the stronger archetypes in the set. It just has so much support in a way that not all of the color combinations do. So we move on to one of the other tribes. This time it's Red-Green Werewolves / Wolves. Both are supported. Ulrich's Kindred is sort of the card that pushes you that way. A 3-mana 3/2 with Trample, who can give attacking wolves or werewolves indestructible. That'd be cool if it's indestructible and Trample. I almost said Trample there, but it's just indestructible. Still very good though. Just as a 3-mana 3/2 with Trample that has a sweet activated ability. This is the same again as in original Innistrad. Werewolves were the red-green archetype then, and they're still the red-green archetype now. This deck is a little different than that one, because it takes a little more advantage of the transform mechanic. There's a couple cards that benefit cards that transform, and this is because all werewolves transform. Every color pair, has creatures that transform, but this is a color pair where basically everything transforms, at least for this specific deck. So let's go ahead and look at the commons and uncommons for the werewolf deck and see what we have. We have Howlpack Wolf, a 3-mana 3/3. Pretty good for red, not something it always gets. It does have a downside that it can't block unless you control another wolf or werewolf, but if you're in this deck, you probably control another one, and it's not the biggest downside in an aggro deck anyway. Then we have Cult of the Waxing Moon, a card that cares about transformation. It's not a werewolf itself, but it is a 5-mana 5/4. It's just pretty decent size. I'm not exactly sure why they're that large, since they're just shamans, but when something transforms, you get another wolf token onto the battlefield every time it happens. It does have to be transform into a non-human creature, which most things do in the format, but werewolves have the most of that, so that's why it's worded that way. Then we have Howlpack Resurgence, which has payoff for wolves and werewolves. You can flash it in, which is nice. It also gives all wolves and werewolves +1/+1 and Trample. So if you get deep into the werewolf deck, Howlpack Resurgence is a big beating for your opponent. Moonlight Hunt sort of reminds me of Nissa's Judgment. Obviously, it's not quite as good, but it is an instant speed removal spell for green that you don't often see. It's only going to be good in a deck that has, let's say, 10 to 12 wolves in it, or werewolves. But if you get there, it's very good. And, this deck can get there if it's open, of course. So Moonlight Hunt, good removal spell, but only if you're in the werewolf deck. Thornhide Wolves, just a vanilla 5-mana 4/5, something you'll play some of the time, but hopefully not most of the time. So Thornhide Wolves basically just sort of a filler card, but luckily there's tons more wolves and werewolves. One of them, which is one of the best one I think, is Breakneck Rider, a 3-mana 3/3, who, by the way, all werewolves have the same transform requirements. If no spells were cast on a player's turn, on the next upkeep, the werewolf transforms. And Breakneck Rider transforms into a frightening 4/3, who gives all attacking creatures, including himself actually, +1, +0, and Trample. They all untransform the same way too if someone casts 2 spells. So that is something you're at the mercy of a little bit with this deck. But something I like is that most of the werewolves, even if they turn back into humans, aren't terrible, and Breakneck Rider is one of them. Convicted Killer, unfortunately, is pretty bad if you can't make it stay transformed, because it's a 3-mana 2/2, but it transforms into a 4/4 with no abilities or anything. It's just vanilla. I think he's more of like a filler level werewolf, but I think you'll play him sometimes, especially if you're deep in werewolves. Then we have Gatstaff Arsonist, who I think is one of the best commons in the set because it's already a 5-mana 5/4, something you're pretty happy to have. But it also transforms into a dude with menace and is a 6/5, difficult to block and difficult to deal with. Kessig Forgemaster, another good example of a werewolf who's good even if they don't transform, because it's a 2-mana 2/1 who can swing through creatures with 1 toughness without actually killing it, even though it's a 2/1. And it has the same transform ability. Once it transforms, it becomes a 3/2 with that same ability, except it does 2 damage, making it even harder to block. Village Messenger, not one I love a whole lot, but again, if you get deep on werewolves, it's pretty good. It's a 1-mana 1/1 with haste, who transforms into a 2/2 with menace. Like, if you could consistently make that happen in the early game, it'd be good. But the problem is, if you're giving up a turn to do it, it's not that good. However, if you can consistently play him turn 1 and your opponent never does anything, then of course he does get quite good. But you can't guarantee that's going to happen. If you draw him at any other stage of the game, he's pretty mediocre. So I don't love Village Messenger, but again, if you end up with all the werewolf synergies in the world, then you'd probably take him anyway. This is another one where there's so many commons and uncommons that we just have a second page to talk about it. One of the best, I think the best uncommon in the set is here, and that's Duskwatch Recruiter. 2 mana, 2/2, lets you look at the top 3 cards of your library and pick a creature from among it and put it into your hand, so he draws you cards. Always good. Once he transforms, he makes creature spells cheaper and gets a little bit bigger. He's just very good. There's also Solitary Hunter, a 4 mana, 3/4, something you're okay with already, who transforms into a vanilla 5/6. Hermit of the Natternulls is a pretty cool card. Because it's a 3 mana 2/3, and if your opponent casts a spell during your turn, whether removal or whatever, you get to draw a card. So it does at least make your opponent play a little bit differently. And he transforms into a 3/5 who has the same ability, except you get to draw 2 cards. Another card that transforms, but isn't actually a creature that is at its best in a werewolf deck, is Neglected Heirloom, who, oh my gosh, they actually managed to print a good piece of equipment, not at rare, for the first time in a while in limited. And what we have is Neglected Heirloom, a 1 mana equipment that equips for 1, gives something +1/+1. So Leonin Scimitar, a card that was very good in its day in Mirrodin block. But if it's on a creature who transforms, it transforms as well. And it gives that creature +3/+3 and has first strike, and it stays transformed, which can kind of be the downside because you have to pay 3. But if you can make it stick on a creature who transforms, your opponent's going to be dead pretty quickly. So that's something that I think is at its best in this deck. We also have Hinterland Logger, a bear, a 2 mana, 2 power creature who transforms into a 4/2 Trampler. And a creature who doesn't transform is Pack Guardian, who's very good. 4 mana, 4/3 with Flash. You can discard a land to put a wolf into play. Helps you get to Delirium, and 4 mana for 6 power and 5 toughness is very good. Lambhold Pacifist isn't one I'm completely certain I like at this point. It's definitely one I have to play with. It can't attack unless you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which means most werewolves once they're transformed, I guess. And it just transforms into a vanilla 4/4. So I don't like it a whole lot. I could be proven wrong. It may turn out that it's pretty good because it can block really well early game, and it can attack hard in the later game, but I don't know. And another wolf that's around is Quilled Wolf, just a serviceable filler wolf, who any green deck will probably play a few of, but is at its best in this deck. There's also some rares that support this archetype. We have Silverfur Partisan, a 3 mana 2/2, who makes it so all removal spells basically give you a wolf token, so you get replacements. So he's difficult to deal with. You pay 3, your opponent has to spend a creature to kill him, and you get a wolf. Pretty good, if they use a spell to kill him anyway. But it makes all your wolves do that, so that's pretty great. And he has Trample for when that's relevant. I always think it's weird when a 2 power creature has Trample, but sometimes it matters. Especially you can use stuff like Combat Tricks on him, which also gives you a 2/2 wolf, and then he gets a little scarier. There's also Gyre Reach Bandit, who transforms into Vilden Pack Alpha, which is pretty good in this deck because it just makes all your creatures transform immediately when they enter the battlefield, which most of them you want to transform. There's also Sage of Ancient Lore, who I don't love, but he does replace himself immediately. He draws you a card, and his power and toughness is equal to the number of cards in your hand. And if you're doing a werewolf deck, once your werewolves are transformed, this is sort of the idea behind the card. You're not going to be playing very many spells, so you're going to hold on to cards so that 2 spells don't get cast, and so he'll get big. And he transforms the same way they all do, and then he gets even scarier. He gets Vigilance and Trample, and his power is equal to the number of cards in all players' hands. So he's a card, like I guess I just said, that I'm a little uncertain about how good he'll be, because they're definitely, in limited, you often don't want to just be holding on to a bunch of cards. You can't really afford to do it, even if your werewolves are transformed. But I could see him being good in some cases. Then there's Arlen Cord, who's a ridiculous bomb, but you can only play really in a red-green deck, and it's at its best here anyway because she makes wolf tokens. She can also give stuff Vigilance and Haste, and she flips into a werewolf planeswalker, of course. and can give trample the things to your whole team and +1/+1. She can lightning bolt things and make all your creatures have a sort of fight ability. So she's very good. I mean, you don't need me to tell her that she should be in your red-green werewolf deck, but she should be. All right, so that does it for werewolves. I think another, like black-red vampire, is a very heavily supported archetype. And from werewolves, we move on to the last of the tribal archetypes, which is white-green humans. It was the same in the original Innistrad block, as most of these archetypes are. And Veteran Cathar is the card that tells us that, you know, those two colors go together for a human deck, because she's a 2-mana 2/2 who can give things, humans only actually, double strike until end of turn for 3 and a white, including herself. So quite a good card, has a lot of upside, and is best when you have a lot of humans. Now let's look at the commons and uncommons for this deck and see if there's enough to make the green-white humans a well-supported archetype. So we're going to look at humans. It's also important to note that there are a couple sub-themes within this, and one of them is equipment, and the other one is investigation. So we'll talk about both of those sort of separately, but some of those cards are going to show up here as well. For example, we have Militant Inquisitor, who's a 3-mana 2/3, who gets +1/+0 for each equipment you control. So, you know, he's a solid, playable, you know, probably you cut him about half the time unless you have a lot of human synergies. But if you have even 1 or 2 pieces of equipment, he gets a little better. Another card that cares about equipment is Strength of Arms, which is a solid combat trick. Most 1-mana ones are, because you don't have to leave much up. It's easy to bluff them as well. 1 white mana for +2/+2, and you have some upside. If you have equipment, you get another human on the battlefield. So those are the two main payoff cards for equipment at common anyway in white. We'll talk about an uncommon one momentarily. We also have Unruly Mob, who was a good card last time he was around. Probably stands to be a good card this time. But, you know, not incredible. We had Rot Shambler recently, and there's not a huge sacrifice archetype, but Unruly Mob, you know, makes it so trading is a lot better for you. So he's an interesting card. You probably wouldn't be upset to have one of in your deck. Dauntless Cathar is a human who also makes spirits. I just have him here, you know, because he's just a very good card in general, a good common who happens to be human. So I think you'll play him, but really any white deck will play him, including the spirit one. So yeah. Hope Against Hope is not something I recommend playing at all. It's on my list of cards I would never play in the format. It just requires too much, but I sort of have it there to indicate to you. I'll have a couple cards here. They wanted auras, I guess, to be a sub-theme as well for humans with a card like Hope Against Hope. Unfortunately, neither of the auras that care about humans are especially good. So I don't recommend actually playing Hope Against Hope. I'm just showing you that, you know, that was a part of the human archetype that I think kind of failed because auras are just usually pretty bad unless they have some effect that keeps them from being bad. Inspiring Captain is a pretty good human, pumps all your creatures and happens to be a human. So another card a lot of decks would be happy to play, but it's a human, so it's best in a lot of ways anyway in this white-green deck. Nearheath Chaplain, again, the friend of Dauntless Cathar, who's a human, who also makes spirits, so a card a lot of people will be after. Paranoid Parish Blade, a 3-mana 3/2 with a lot of upside, because if you get to Delirium, it's a 4/2 for a striker. Stern Constable is a way to make Madness or Delirium happen, while also tapping things for free. So it's a card I could see being pretty solid, because it can tap things down for free, even though you have to discard. Equestrian Skill is the other aura that I don't like at all, but you know, paying 4 mana and easily getting 2 for 1 isn't usually my cup of tea. You can watch my top 10 cards I'll never play in Shadows Over Innistrad video if you want to hear more about that. But again, just to show you, they thought auras were going to be a thing, but they didn't actually print any that are worth putting on your humans. Intrepid Provisioner, though, is a decent payoff for playing humans. It's a 4-mana 3/3 Trampler who pumps a human by +2/+2 until end of turn, so that's not too bad. Abyssinian Missionaries is another reason to play equipment. It's a 4-mana 3/3 human, and when it gets equipped, it transforms and Oblivion Rings something. So it is very strong. It is a good reason to play equipment in this deck. So we also have Open the Armory, who can help you search for equipment or for auras. I have it there because there's actually a good aura removal spell. So if you pick up that and like one piece of equipment, you probably want to play Open the Armory. It'd be better if it was attached to a body, of course, but it's still pretty solid. So now we'll talk about the two sort of mini sub-themes that you can find within green-white, one of which you've already talked about, some equipment, but we'll talk about Investigate first. There are several cards that happen to be humans that have Investigate. I do think that the blue-green archetype is more about investigating, and we'll talk about that archetype in a little bit. But you could sometimes end up with some Investigate synergies within green-white. Thraben Inspector is a fairly solid card. I mean, 1 mana for a 1/2. And, you know, it's not quite Elvish Visionary, but it is larger, so it can block more creatures and kill them and survive blocking. And it's got some human synergies we just talked about. And, you know, the Investigate will come in handy down the road. Briarbridge Patrol is a very good card because all it has to do is deal damage to creatures to investigate, unlike most things that have to deal damage to players. And, I mean, the second part's sort of trinket text. I'm not sure how often you'll pull it off. But if you sacrifice 3 tokens in a turn, you get a free creature, three clue tokens. Byway Courier, it's solid human who's a 3 mana 3/2 who investigates when he dies. And Ulven Wild Mysteries, which lets you investigate every time a creature dies and puts white human soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield. Ulven Wild Mysteries is probably one of the few of these that is like equally good in this one and in the blue-green deck because it makes humans that happen to be white too. So it's sort of showing you white-green can have a sub-theme of investigate, but I think it's definitely a lot bigger in blue-green, and we'll talk about that later. And we'll talk about equipment now. We mentioned Neglected Heirloom before. It's a solid piece of equipment that you'll be happy to play in this deck if you get the cards that want equipment, and you'll be happy to play it anyway, probably. But it's actually really good. Like, it's, you know, it's not always going to happen, but putting this in Abyssinian Missionaries is pretty messed up because it immediately will transform. And if you'll remember, so your Abyssinian Missionaries will exile your opponent's best permanent and become a 7/7 with first strike. So pretty nice. True Faith Censor is not quite as good as Neglected Heirloom. In fact, it's really nowhere near as good. But if you end up with enough humans and enough human synergies, it does get marginally better. And I think, you know, playing one of these isn't the end of the world, although I don't love it. And Shard of Broken Glass is the one I love the least. Although if you end up with several cards with Delirium in your human deck, then Shard of Broken Glass is probably worth playing. So let's look at some rares that support this archetype. We have Thalia's Lieutenant, sort of one of the human lords. Puts a +1/+1 counter on all your humans, so pretty big payoff. This is another one where if after pack 1 you're looking at your cards and they're mostly green and white and they're humans, you should probably take Thalia's Lieutenant, pick one in pack 2 because it's pretty ridiculous. It pumps all your humans and then starts pumping itself. There's another creature that transforms in white, and it's just a bear. But once he transforms, he has power and toughness equal to the number of creatures you control, and turns out a human cleric creature token every turn, which is quite good. Slayer's Plate is, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's great, but I do like that it at least gives you some value if you put it on humans. A 6 mana commitment for +4/+2 is pretty steep, but it does get slightly better when you get a spirit token if it's attached to a human. I would probably only play it if I had like 2 Abyssinian Missionaries and maybe that other guy who cares about equipment, the 2/3 who gets +1/+0 for equipment. But, you know. And Tireless Tracker is another card that cares about clues and investigation. It's better in this deck. Well, it's not better in this deck. It's better in the blue-green deck. But in this deck, you'll be pretty happy to have him because he investigates every time you play a land. He doesn't even have to do anything. So he just churns out, clue tokens. And he gets bigger every time you sacrifice one. He's a very good card. All right, so that does it for the allied color pairs, for the tribal color pairs. From there, we will move to the enemy color pairs. Now, these color pairs are a little bit different. They're not tribal, although tribal things can, of course, happen in any of them at times, because as we saw, there's lots of tribal stuff going on. But here we have, instead of a creature with an activated ability, a non-creature card that has an activated ability of an enemy color that is meant to guide us towards the various archetypes. So what we have are blue-green Investigate, blue-red Spells Matter, black-white Tokens / Go Wide, black-green Delirium, and red-white Aggro. And those are the archetypes we have. And we will start with blue-green Investigate. So the card we have for blue-green Investigate is pretty awesome. I'll be straightforward and tell you guys that the blue-green deck is the one I'm probably the most excited to draft, and I think it looks like it's the most fun, so I may be a bit biased about it. That said, even putting my biases aside, Ongoing Investigation is a really sweet card. It makes all of your creatures into sort of pseudo-thieving magpies. You know, your creature attacks the opponent, and if it does damage to them, you get a clue. On top of that, it also lets you turn your creatures in your graveyard into clues, and you get to gain 2 life in the process. So this is how we know Investigate's the archetype. And there's also several cards in blue and green at common and uncommon that either investigate or care about investigating, or sometimes both. So we'll go ahead and look at those. One of them, who's just like, a solid common you'll play in a lot of decks, but is definitely at its best in this deck, is Drownyard Explorers, a 4-mana 2/4, who when it enters the battlefield, you get to investigate. If it were a 4-mana 2/4 that drew you a card when it entered the battlefield, it'd be like a high-level common, so investigating, also a pretty big deal. Then there is Erdwall Illuminator, who we mentioned earlier in the Spirits deck, but it's definitely at its best here because it doubles the number of clues you get once a turn, and that is something you want to be doing in your Clue Investigate deck. Then there's Fleeting Memories, who I think is a legitimate win condition in this deck if you can really get there on the clues. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate, and whenever you sacrifice a clue, you can mill your opponent or yourself if you're trying to hit Delirium or something. I will say you should only play this card, and you should only take it pretty late, and you should only play it in a world where you get a lot of cards that involve investigating. Because if you don't, it's not a very good card at all. You're paying 3 for a card that lets you investigate and mills your opponent 3 cards. But as I said, I can see this deck coming together and Fleeting Memories being a win condition, which is kind of my dream. But there's also Gone Missing, which is a card most blue decks will be happy to play because it puts a permanent, by the way, which is kind of nice. It's not just creatures on top of its owner's library, but it also investigates, so I think it fits best into this deck. There's also Jace's Scrutiny, which is sort of like Fleeting Memories in that I would say it's not that good. Usually those minus power, it's some number, and minus toughness some number cards aren't, no number actually, aren't especially good, but this one has Investigate attached to it, meaning that if you get there, you have Erdwall Illuminator, you have Fleeting Memories, you have all these things going on, you'll probably play Jace's Scrutiny, but that's probably the only time. Press for Answers is a card you're probably happy to play a lot of the time. It's probably actually better in a more aggressive deck. And this deck does have some aggressive creatures, but it's also nice because it can buy you time if that's what you need, and it also allows you to investigate. Trail of Evidence, a card that if you also have Fleeting Memories and tons of control spells and removal, Fleeting Memories and Trail of Evidence together can basically just win you the game, and that's pretty cool. Trail of Evidence is another one I would only play if you really get a massive number of instant and sorcery spells in this case. And it might actually be better to some degree in the blue-red deck where it'll actually investigate for you a little more. There's also creatures that aren't blue that, like this, we just saw Briarbridge Patrol. It investigates every time it deals damage to creatures, and it has that trinket text where you can play whatever creature you want if you sacrifice 3 clues. Then there's Byway Courier, who we saw a moment ago in the white-green deck as well. Just a 3-mana 3/2 who replaces itself with a clue. Then there's a combat trick that'll actually be good if you get a decent number of clues, because it's 1 mana for +1/+1, but I don't think it's going to be that hard for the blue-green deck for it to be at least 1 mana for +2/+2, which is a solid combat trick. And then one of the cards that I think is sort of going to be the mortar of this deck is Graph Mole. It's a 3-mana 2/4, which is already a great deal. We haven't seen a 3-mana 2/4 in a while. On top of that, though, whenever you sacrifice a clue, you gain 3 life. So it buys you a bunch of time, it blocks well, and it lets you sort of try to win the game by drawing a bunch of cards, or, if you're really getting there with Fleeting Memories. Then there's also Ulvenwald Mysteries, another kind of win condition for the deck, which we saw a minute ago. It makes you get lots of spirits, and every time a non-token creature you control dies, you investigate. But it works well with any clues, not just the ones that it makes. Then there's also Weirding Wood, which, first of all, can allow you to splash if you're after that. And on top of that, allows you to investigate. Also lets you ramp if you're looking for that as well. Then there is a Transform card that's quite good, a 2-mana 2/1, who, when you sacrifice a clue, transforms into Bearer of Overwhelming Truths, who has Prowess, which is very nice. And he has, whenever he deals combat damage to a player, you get to investigate. So another solid reason to be in clues. I think the blue-green clue deck is well supported. I think most of the time you're just going to win by having a lot of clues and, just winning with some big green monster or some blue flyer or something like that. But sometimes you'll be able to win with something like Fleeting Memories, and that'll be pretty sweet. There's also some rares that fit well into this deck. Confirmed Suspicions isn't something I would play unless I was deep into this Investigate deck, and then it's very good because it counters a spell and gives you 3 clues. Tireless Tracker is one we've already seen, who basically has landfall, put a clue into play, and whenever you sack a clue, you put a +1/+1 counter on him, so he's like a rare win condition. And Second Harvest I don't love, but just imagining like having 8 clues in play and casting Second Harvest sounds pretty sweet. All right, so that does it for the blue-green clue deck. From there, we'll move on to a blue-red Spells Matter deck. This is a familiar theme we've seen before with blue and red. And here, the card that sort of pushes us that way is Geist Blast, a 3-mana spell that does 2 damage to a creature or player at instant speed, so a good removal spell. But once it's in your graveyard, you can pay 2 and a blue to exile it and copy an instant or sorcery spell you control. Quite a powerful effect depending on what instant or sorcery spell you're playing. So pretty nice guy to have in your graveyard. But let's go ahead and look at the commons and uncommons for this Spells Matter deck. There's lots of card draw in blue and red that also allows you to discard. So that makes cards that have Madness and cards that have Delirium in these 2 colors probably at their best in this specific deck. Pour Over the Pages is one of these, draws you cards, lets you untap 2 things, and you get to discard something. Rise from the Tides is another like sweet build around win condition for this deck. I mean, you can spend the whole game casting instants and sorcery spells that remove things, draw you cards, and then drop Rise from the Tides and just win. I think it's has real potential as a build around, and I think it's at its best in this deck, not actually in the zombie deck, which is more aggressive and won't run enough instant or sorcery spells for it to be good. Catalog, just a good card draw spell at instant speed. Just the Wind is good in any blue deck, but I think it's at its best in this one because you can trigger Madness several ways. Pieces of the Puzzle is an awesome card in this deck, because it fills your graveyard the way you want it to, for Delirium, for example, and it lets you draw 2 cards for 3 at sorcery speed, and you get to choose which to some degree, especially if you really got there in instants and sorceries. One of the win conditions at common is Silberlind Snapper, who's just a massive creature who, if your deck has enough non-creature spells, will be a real problem for your opponent. We also have Trail of Evidence, who gets a lot of value in this deck because you can investigate all the time, because this deck is a Spells Matter deck. There's also Pyre Hound, who doesn't have prowess. We've seen creatures with prowess in this set, but he's almost better. Like, he's a very good common win condition, just like Silberlind Snapper can be, because he gets bigger forever when you play an instant or sorcery spell. You can just hang back with him for a while, and then after a while, he gets to be a big problem for your opponent. Hard for removal spells to kill him, and he just can run over your opponent with Trample. There's also Sanguinary Mage, who has prowess, and I just realized I forgot to put on here the functional reprint of the Jeskai Wind Scout, who's a 3-mana 2/1. It's a spirit who has prowess. That's also very good in this deck. So is Tormenting Voice. It lets you discard cards, and it lets you draw cards, both things you want to be doing. And another win condition that I think is at its best in this deck is probably Manic Scribe. I think the blue-red deck of any deck with blue in it does the best job of filling the graveyard, although the black one does an okay job of it as well, but it doesn't really want to be playing a 2-mana 0/3. This one can support a 2-mana 0/3 with a lot more good removal and stuff like that, and can just win you the game with Manic Scribe from time to time. There's also a few rares that do a good job of supporting this archetype. None of them are like directly like, Spells Matter cards. The one Spells Matter card they have is unplayable in Limited because it was sort of printed for like fun constructed decks. The one that lets you copy a spell in your graveyard. If you cast a spell with the same name, it's going to be hard to pull that off in Limited at all. But I think cards that have Madness and good like high quality red removal is probably at its best here. Avacyn's Judgment has Madness, so you can like draw some cards and then discard Avacyn's Judgment and do X damage. Sin Prodder's pretty good in this deck because it'll either draw you cards or contribute to Delirium or do damage to your opponent, all things you want to do. Wolf of Devil's Breach is actually a wolf who I don't think is at its best in the Werewolf deck, although obviously you'll play it there. But it lets you discard cards to burn your opponent equal to its converted mana cost. And Epiphany at the Drown Yard's very good in this deck too. Fills your graveyard and lets you draw a bunch of cards. So the blue-red Spells Matter deck isn't like heavily supported by any means, but I think it's a pretty sweet deck. I think it's probably the deck that can most effectively be controlling in the format. Usually it's not always blue-red, but I think that's it this time. So that's kind of my take on that, but I'll show you guys shortly where I rank each of these in different tiers. So on we go to black-green. The archetype there is Delirium. We know that from Autumnal Gloom, a 3-mana enchantment that for 1 black can put the top card of your library into your graveyard, and at the beginning of your end step, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, blah, 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 Delirium, it gives you a 4/4 trample hexproof. It transforms into that, which is quite the threat. It's the only one of these cards that sort of like shows you what archetype it is. that can single-handedly win you the game, and it definitely can against certain boards where, you know, maybe it doesn't kill your opponent, but they end up having to like double or triple block it to kill it, and that works for you. So this is the color pair that has the most cards with Delirium, and it also has the most ways to fill the graveyard, including Autumnal Gloom itself, which both fills the graveyard and has Delirium. So the great thing about Autumnal Gloom is that once you fill your graveyard and transform your creature into Ancient of the Equinox, all your other cards are going to have Delirium too, because that's just the way Delirium works. So you don't really even need it anymore after you get to Delirium. And I think that's pretty sweet because it helps you get there, and once you're there, you're there. So let's look at some commons and uncommons. This list includes cards that either have Delirium or help you get Delirium, and I think in these two colors, and I think that's indicates they are best suited for this deck. One of them is Sinister Concoction, which looks sort of unassuming and probably is a terrible card in any other deck, but in this deck, it can single-handedly almost get you to Delirium, because it throws an enchantment in your graveyard. You put the top card of your library in your graveyard, and you discard a card. And it sacrifices itself, and you get to blow up a creature. So all of those things together are pretty good. You know, killing a creature is good, but it also can single-handedly get you to pretty close to. You could destroy your own creature with it. I guess then you do have a chance of getting there with the one card, but you don't really want to do that. But in this deck, it's actually a solid removal spell that helps you get to Delirium, and I think that's relevant. An example of a card with Delirium in black and green is a 4-mana 3/3, who is going to be pretty good in this deck if you can get Delirium consistently, because he can do his ability as many times as you want. He can pump +1/+1 as many times as you want, as long as you have Delirium and as long as you have the mana. So he can be a big problem attacking. I mean, we just recently had Sludge Crawler, who was a 1-mana creature who had the pump ability that cost about the same, and it was a big problem. And Stallion of Ashmouth is bigger to begin with, which also means it's more expensive to cast, but I think it's pretty high quality. Tooth Collector, I think, is a very good black uncommon in general. At its best, if you can really get to Delirium, though, because it can shrink something every turn or kill it. And, you know, he's a 3-mana 3/2 who shrinks something the turn he comes into play. Crow of Dark Tidings is good in the zombie deck, but it's also good here because it helps you get to Delirium, plus it's a threat in the air. Same with Hound of Farbogs. And, you know, it's kind of replacement level in both. You're happy to have it. I mean, you know, you're not happy to have it, but you don't hate having it, I guess. It's kind of where you are with Hound of the Farbogs. You can get Delirium more easily, so him having Menace is, you know, relevant. Liliana's Indignation, I mentioned earlier, card I'm uncertain of. If any deck can abuse Liliana's Indignation, though, it's probably this one. But I don't love the card yet. I'll have to be proven wrong about it, but who knows? Maybe it's a little better than it looks. Fork in the Road is a card that can help you splash, which is relevant. But it also adds 2 cards to your Delirium count. And if Delirium is as valuable as it's potentially looking in this deck, you're pretty okay with paying 2 mana to fix your mana and get halfway to Delirium. And, you know, that's not too bad. One of the common win conditions for this deck is going to be Kessig Direswine, who's a 6-mana 6/6. Already something you're probably going to put in your deck, in your control deck anyway. And he gets Trample if you have Delirium. There's also Might Beyond Reason, which is an okay combat trick for putting 2+1/+1 counters on something. But if you can consistently get Delirium, paying 4 for 3+1/+1 counters is a pretty good deal. Moldgraph Scavenger is another very good common card if Delirium is as easy to get as it appears it might be able to be in this deck, because paying 2, even doesn't matter what point of the game it is, really. Paying 2 for a 3/4 is really great value. I've seen people call this the Pauper Tarmogoyf even, so it's probably going to see play in Pauper. So I think it can also be good in limited. Obsessive Skinner is one of the better cards with Delirium. He's a 2-mana 1/1 who can put a +1/+1 counter on something, including himself. And then if you have Delirium, he can do it every single one of your opponent's upkeeps. So that's the commons and uncommons. And then for rares, we have Mindrack Demon. I covered it up there on accident, but he's a 4-mana 4/5 who, when he comes into play, puts the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then at your upkeep he has Delirium. And it says you lose 4 life at the beginning of your upkeep unless you meet the Delirium requirements. To the Slaughter's a 3-mana Edict effect that can also hit Planeswalkers. It says sacrifice a creature or Planeswalker, and if you have Delirium, they sacrifice 2. Deathcap Cultivator is going to be good in any green deck, really, but he's probably at his best here because he has Delirium, and he'll have that most often. And the ramping into 2 colors is great. Inexorable Blob is a potential like sleeper bomb in this format if you can really get there on Delirium, because if you play him on like turn 3 and you already have Delirium, your opponent's going to be in a lot of trouble. Soul Swallower is a card that any deck will play, really, but at its best if you can really hit Delirium. As a 4-mana 3/3 with Trample, who gets much larger every turn if you have Delirium. And Traverse the Uvenwald is another card that can help you fix, and then if you get to Delirium, can be a very powerful tutor. So that's black-green. From there, we move on to black-white, which I think is a black-white tokens deck. This archetype, though, isn't quite as self-explanatory as the others. The others really, push you in a certain direction. And this one, you kind of look at the card and you're like, well, I guess you're supposed to build like a weenie aggro deck. And, because it can pump everything, but it also can give them Skulk. It does give them Skulk. And so I think it's supposed to be a black-white tokens deck, a black-white weenie aggro deck of some kind or another. And so we'll look at commons and uncommons and see whether or not that deck can actually get there. So Dauntless Cathar is going to be good in a deck like this because he himself is a decent creature already, and once he makes a spirit token, that spirit will probably never be able to be blocked if you have that enchantment in play, for example. But counting on that enchantment is counting on a lot. Nearheath Chaplain's even better because it helps you go wide in a more effective way than Dauntless Cathar does. There's also a number of other effects that pump your whole team. I think Tenacity is one of the better ones we've seen in a while, mostly because you can use it defensively. You can also use it offensively, and the life gain can be massive for 2 mana. Not Forgotten is a card that I don't love, but if it's got a place, it's probably this deck. You can force your opponent to draw something from their graveyard when you're worried, they might draw something else. You can also put one of your best cards on top of your library, and in the process, you get a 1/1 white spirit token. So it's, not as bad as most of those effects we see, because at least it does something. Inspiring Captain, another way to pump your whole team. Ethereal Guidance, another way to pump your whole team. Call the Bloodline, a way to make sure you have a bunch of tokens. Giss's Bidding is one of the best ways to sort of go wide in the format. 4 mana to get 2/2/2s is pretty good. We just recently had Allied Reinforcements be a very good, high-quality uncommon in Oath of the Gatewatch, and Giss's Bidding is sort of an imitation of that. Shamble Back, if it has a place, is also here. Gives you a zombie token, gains you some life. Ghoul Caller's Accomplice is good in the zombie deck and fine here. But I do think that this deck is really, really under supported. I think that the uncommon they gave it isn't especially good. If they'd given us a card like, let's say, Lingering Souls or Spectral Procession, any way to make several spirit tokens with flying other than Nearheath Chaplain, the deck would be a lot better. Or more ways to make zombie tokens efficiently. Like getting 2 for 1 card, a few more ways would be a lot better. I think this archetype's really undersupported, but there's one rare that's going to be good in it, and that is From Under the Floorboards. It has Madness, so if you can pull that off, it's great. But even if you can't pull that off in limited, 5 mana for 6 power and 3 life is pretty great. So you'll be pretty happy with that. But I think really any deck will be happy with From Under the Floorboards that has black in it. But it probably is at its best if you can somehow get there on a get-wide black-white deck. But I don't see it happening very often. I think it'll be an underdrafted archetype, kind of like Blue-Green was in Oath of the Gatewatch, because there's just not enough support. So that brings us to our last of the color combinations, and that which brings us to red-white, which is basically just, I guess, a red-white aggro deck. Nahiri's Machinations is probably the worst of all of these uncommons, the cycle of uncommons. It gives something indestructible, but only during combat on your turn, so your opponent can just kill something before you get to your turn, or kill it in response to this after the trigger happens, which is really bad. And it can deal 1 damage to blocking creatures for a somewhat expensive amount for how limited the ability is. For this one, I sort of just tried to look at low curve, high power creatures, and there are a few of those. Gibbering Fiend would be good in a deck like this. 2 mana, 2/1, who if you hit Delirium, pings an opponent every turn. Valdaran Duelist is great in any sort of aggressive deck. Moorland Drifter is solid in any white deck. Hulking Devil, if there's a place for it, this is it. And Devil Thorn Fox is a card any white deck will play. But there's really not that much support for this archetype. There aren't enough low curve aggressive creatures. There's more in most of the color combinations that actually are like the tribal archetypes, which makes sense. I mean, you can make a white red deck that has a bunch of the good red vampires in it, but you're missing out because you're not getting all of the synergy you should be getting out of being able to discard things because you're in white. And I think this archetype is the least supported of any of them, and it's not one I like a whole lot, and hopefully not one I ever end up in. I mean, if you open up a couple bombs in these two colors and have to put a deck together, it's not the end of the world. But I think this is a very weak archetype. And to segue, that's a good way to segue into my tiers about the archetypes, my archetype rankings. This is sort of my feeling of the 10 archetypes in Shadows Over Innistrad, based on how much support each of them has received and how good the cards within those archetypes are. I've divided the archetypes into 3 tiers based on my initial impression. Within the tiers, the decks are more or less equal, at least until I get a chance to play with the cards. It's important to note, by the way, again, that these tiers don't mean you shouldn't draft or build certain decks. Sometimes people take tiers that way, and that's one reason I've never really put them on my limited videos before, because some people just really go and draft and try to draft whatever's tier 1, but you have to sort of let the draft guide you where you're going. Sometimes even the awful red-white deck, you'll get past all the good red and white removal, and you'll get amazing bombs in those colors, and that'll actually be a better deck than one of the tier 1 decks I'm about to talk about. That happened recently in Triple Battle for Zendikar. People stopped drafting green altogether because they heard it was bad, but what that meant was whoever was realizing the green cards they were getting past would end up with multiple green, high-quality uncommons, and rares even. So that's something to keep in mind. Draft is self-correcting, and certain archetypes, even if they're considered tier 1, if too many people are drafting them, they become terrible. And certain archetypes, even if they're the worst archetype in the format, can be good if no one's drafting those colors. So the cards for those colors. So without further ado, we'll start with tier 1, which is where I have black-red vampires, red-green werewolves, and blue-green investigate. Those are the 3 archetypes that I see having the most support and being the most sort of dynamic and having the most synergy between the cards within each of them. If I had to pick which one I think is the best right this second, I guess I would say black-red vampires, just because there seems to be so much synergy there, as you likely gathered from my discussing of it. So that's what tier 1 is for me. Those are the 3 best archetypes. Tier 2 has the most decks in it, and those are all decks that are perfectly solid. They have a decent amount of support, but they don't have enough to be incredible the way that I can see the vampires, werewolves, and investigate decks being. Like I said, the blue-white spirits deck is just a skies deck. That's almost always a middle of the pack deck, although actually in Triple Battle for Zendikar it was a high quality deck, but it's almost always a middle of the pack deck. There's just not a lot of synergy there. Black-green Delirium of all of these is the one I could see skipping up to tier 1, but I'm so uncertain as to how easy it is to get to Delirium, even with all the support it has, that I'm not certain that it's tier 1, but I could see it getting there. Green-white humans is basically just sort of a green-white aggro deck that has a few human synergies. It loses a lot of its power because 2 of the cards that were printed for it to be part of the archetype are awful auras that you don't want to ever be playing, no matter how many humans are in your deck. I shouldn't say ever. If you're playing against someone who has 0 removal, siding them in's not bad, but other than that, it's pretty bad. Blue-black zombies, another middle-of-the-pack one. It's sort of like a mid-range deck that has a lot of removal and can, win with a bunch of zombies who can come back from the graveyard. It has a decent amount of synergy, but the power level of the cards isn't the most impressive. Blue-red Spells Matter is an interesting deck, and I think it's the best control deck in the format. But I'm not sure that's the best thing to have in this format yet. You kind of have to see how fast it is. But it does have interesting ways to win the game, such as putting a bunch of zombie tokens into play because you played a lot of instant or sorceries, or milling your opponent to death with a Delirium creature. Those are both very good. And, if you've done your math, there's 2 decks in Tier 3, and you could probably guess what they were based on my discussion of them. And those are the 2 decks that have basically no support and no cohesiveness to them. Black-white tokens, if you end up in a world where you get a bunch of the that cycle of enchantments that can sacrifice themselves, there's one that can put 2 1/1 spirits into play that I actually didn't put on the list because even with that, I don't think the black-white tokens is good enough. But I could see a world where you get like 4 or 5 of those and a bunch of anthem effects, and that being a pretty good deck. So I do think it's actually better than red-white aggro, which I'm just not certain as to where they expected people to go there. There's no real cohesiveness other than low-costed creatures. Red and white do have some good removal, so sometimes that'll come together. But I think that the decks that are better that have red and white in them will also be taking that removal. So red white aggro, it seems to me to be one of the worst deck in the format right now. Probably means I'll end up losing to it in one of my draft videos, but that's how I feel now. Anyway, that's the end of this archetype overview. I actually kept it shorter than I have in the past, which is good. Thanks for watching. I hope you found all the limited review content I did this past week to be helpful for your pre-release preparation and getting ready to start drafting the format. And I do this every time a set comes out, so you have more of that to look forward to. If you're subscribed, and if you're not, you should go ahead and subscribe. And also don't forget to like this video. That helps out the video to see more people. And comment if you think anything about this video one way or another, whether you think I'm wrong, whether you think I'm right. Just let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.